Flight Lieutenant Aaron Hartley could smell his engine burning. Not smoking, burning. The glycol coolant was gone. The temperature gauge was pinned past every red line. Black smoke poured from the cowling like a funeral ribbon. He was 22 miles off the coast of France. The Spitfire had maybe 5 minutes before the fuel lines caught and turned the cockpit into a crematorium. He could bail now, hit the channel, survive. But the B-17, limping 200 yards to his left, 9 men aboard, wouldn't make it without him. So Hartley stayed, 40 more miles. Until land. Until they had a chance. He would never see land. It was March 14th, 1944, mid-morning. The sky over the English Channel was clear, perfect visibility. The kind of weather that made bombing runs precise and fighter intercepts deadly. The mission had been straightforward. 12 B-17 flying fortresses from the 390th Bomb Group hitting rail yards outside Amiens. Strategic targets. Supply lines feeding German divisions. Hartley's squadron, 8 Spitfires, was flying close escort. The Luftwaffe had been quiet for most of the run, too quiet. Then, 6 minutes ago, 4 FW-190S came down out of the sun. The fight lasted 90 seconds. 2 Fu-190S went down, 1 Spitfire, and Hartley's engine took cannon fire from a deflection shot he never saw coming. 20mm shells, high explosive. 2 of them punched through the cowling and shredded the coolant system, ripped through pipes and seals. The 3rd took out his radio, severed the antenna mount. No communication, no way to call for help. No way to tell anyone what was happening. The bombers turned for home. Hartley's wingman, Flying Officer Marsh, pulled alongside and signaled, hand gestures, clear, urgent, pointed down, bail out, now. Standard procedure. A dead engine over the channel meant you had one choice. Get out, hit the water, hope the air-sea rescue launches found you before hypothermia did. The water temperature this time of year was 8 degrees Celsius, 46 Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill you in 20 minutes, maybe 30 if you were strong and lucky. But then Hartley looked left. The B-17 nearest him, tail number 297, was trailing smoke from its number 3 engine. The entire outboard nacelle was black, scorched. The prop was feathered, dead. That bomber was flying on 3 engines, and from the way it was losing altitude, shallow but steady, one of those 3 wasn't running clean either. Hartley did the math. 3 engines, crew of 9, 40 miles to the English coast. If nothing else failed, they'd make it, probably. But if the Germans came back, that bomber had no chance. It was slow, wounded, falling behind the formation. The other B-17s were already a mile ahead, pulling away. A lone bomber was a target. A wounded lone bomber was a kill. A Fu-190 could shred it in one pass. Cannon fire through the cockpit, through the fuel tanks. The crew wouldn't have time to bail. They'd just burn. Hartley's engine temperature was climbing past every gauge limit. The needle was buried. His airspeed was dropping. He had maybe 4 minutes before the engine locked up completely. If he bailed now, he'd hit the water. Cold, but survivable. Rescue launches operated in this area. They'd find him, eventually. If he stayed, he'd have to fly a burning aircraft for 40 miles with no engine power, no radio, and no guarantee. 9 men. He stayed. Hartley was 27 years old, from a town called Maidstone in Kent. Small place. Market town. His father ran a bakery on the high street, been in the family for 3 generations. Fresh bread every morning. The smell of it filled their house. His mother taught piano lessons in their front room. Hartley had grown up hearing scales and arpeggios through the floorboards. Before the war, he'd been studying engineering at university in London. He liked numbers, systems, the way things fit together, the way problems had solutions if you thought them through. This problem had a solution. It just didn't include him surviving. He had a fiancée, Sarah. They'd met in 1941 at a dance in Canterbury, one of those community events organized to boost morale during the Blitz. She worked as a nurse at the hospital. Dark hair, quick laugh, the kind of person who made you feel like the room got brighter when she walked in. They'd gotten engaged 6 months ago. Small ceremony, just family, his mother cried. His father shook his hand. The wedding was planned for June, 3 months away. Sarah had been making arrangements, booking the church, finding a dress. She'd sent him 3 letters in the past 2 weeks. He kept them in his map case, folded carefully. The last one talked about a cottage she'd found near Canterbury. Small, brick. Ivy on the walls. Garden in the back with apple trees. She said it was perfect. Said they'd be happy there. Said she could already picture him sitting in the garden reading the newspaper on Sunday mornings. Hartley would never see that cottage. He throttled back as far as he dared, hoping to buy time. The engine was still turning, still producing thrust, but the temperature wasn't dropping. The smoke was getting thicker. He could see it now, pouring from the cowling seams. And then he saw the flickers, orange, small, licking out from the inspection panel gaps. The fire was inside the engine. The B-17 crew had seen him. The waist gunner on the left side was waving frantically, gesturing with both hands, pointing down. Emphatic. Get out. Save yourself. Hartley shook his head. Slow. Deliberate. Pointed forward. Stay with you. The waist gunner stopped waving. Just stared. His face was visible through the window. Young. Maybe 20. Then he raised his hand. A salute. Slow. Deliberate. The kind you give at a funeral. Hartley returned it. Sharp. Clean. He checked his altitude. 4,000 feet. The controls felt heavy, mushy. Something in the hydraulics or elevator trim was failing. Fluid leaking somewhere. The plane was dying under him, one system at a time. He scanned the horizon. Clear. No enemy aircraft. The rest of the German fighters had broken off after the initial pass. That didn't mean they wouldn't come back. Wounded bombers were easy kills. He'd seen it a dozen times. Watched B-17s fall out of formation and get swarmed. Watched them spiral into the sea trailing fire. He wasn't going to let that happen to 297. The channel stretched out below, gray, endless. The engine fire was worse now. Flames visible through the inspection panel gaps. The cockpit was getting hot, not unbearable yet. But the heat was rising. The instrument panel was starting to blur from the thermal distortion in the air. Hartley's altimeter read 3,800 feet. The B-17 was at 3,500. Falling slower than him. He needed to stay above them, high cover. If the Germans came back, altitude was everything. Altitude meant he could dive, threaten, make them think twice. 28 miles to the coast. If he could hold this heading for another 12 minutes, they'd be over land. 12 minutes. Not long. The length of 3 songs on the radio. His engine had maybe 6 minutes left. The math wasn't working. The flames crawled along the engine, cowling. Orange. Bright. Spreading. The fire was feeding on oil residue, paint, rubber seals. The fuel lines were next. Once those caught, the wing tanks would go. 1,200 liters of high-octane aviation fuel, enough to vaporize the cockpit before he knew what happened. The Spitfire was shaking now, vibration from the damaged engine. The whole airframe felt like it was coming apart. The control stick was hot under his gloves. The B-17 was still there, left side. Slightly below, he could see faces in the waist gun windows. 2 men watching, one holding a camera. Someone was documenting this. The photos would show a Spitfire trailing smoke, flames visible. Flying formation, with a crippled bomber. The flames were past the firewall. The firewall was supposed to contain engine fires, steel, asbestos lining, give the pilot time to shut down, bail out, but the fire had breached it. He reached for the fire extinguisher trigger, red handle, pulled it. A burst of foam shot into the engine compartment. The flames dimmed for 5 seconds, then they came back stronger. The extinguisher was empty. His airspeed was down to 140 knots, about 160 miles per hour. The Spitfire's stall speed was around 90. He had 50 knots of margin. If the engine seized completely, he'd lose 20 knots immediately. That left 30. Barely enough. If he had to maneuver, he'd stall. A stalled aircraft, at 3,000 feet over water, didn't recover. You'd go in nose first. The impact would kill you instantly. Hartley's left hand was cramping on the throttle. He didn't dare move it. The engine was so unstable that even a slight adjustment might kill it completely. He was flying on the edge of failure. Every second the engine kept running was a second he didn't expect. The cockpit was filling with smoke, not thick yet, just enough to sting his eyes. He cracked the canopy open 2 inches. The slipstream howled, sucked some smoke out. The rest stayed. Chemical. Bitter. He was breathing it now. The B-17's pilot waggled his wings. A signal. We see you. Thank you. Get out. Hartley waggled back. Still here. The bomber crew didn't know his radio was dead. They thought he was choosing to stay silent. They had no way to know he couldn't call for help. If he went down now, no one would know where. The channel would swallow him. The Spitfire would sink. He'd just be another name on a missing aircrew list. The fire was consuming the engine now. The cowling was glowing red. Flames 3 feet long streaming back along the fuselage. He could feel the heat through the floor panels. His boots were getting hot. The rubber soles starting to soften. The altimeter read 2,200 feet. He'd lost 1,600 feet in 8 minutes. The glide ratio was steeper than it should be. Something in the aerodynamics was wrong. Drag from the fire. Turbulence from the smoke. He could see the coastline now. A thin gray line. England. Home. The cliffs of Dover were visible. White. Distinct. Beautiful. He'd grown up 20 miles from those cliffs. Spent summers hiking the ridges. Swimming in the cold water. He wasn't going to make it back. The engine seized. No warning. Just a sudden, violent stop. The propeller locked. The Spitfire lurched forward. Hartley's head snapped against the headrest. Hard. The airspeed dropped instantly. 140 knots to 115. The nose pitched down. He pulled back on the stick. Trimmed for glide. The Spitfire leveled out. Barely. The controls were sluggish. He was gliding now. No power, no engine. Just momentum and gravity. 6 miles to the coast. The fire was worse. Without the engine running, there was no airflow to blow it back. The flames spread forward into the cockpit, orange light flickering across the instrument panel. The map case was smoldering, the leather turning black, curling. The letters were in that case. 3 letters from Sarah. The last one about the cottage near Canterbury, about the garden with apple trees. The map case caught fire. Hartley kept his eyes on the altimeter. The airspeed indicator. The horizon. Flying the plane. That's all that mattered. Keep it flying. Keep it stable. Keep the B-17 covered. The B-17 was pulling ahead, still on 3 engines, still flying. The crew in the waist were waving, frantic, desperate, pointing down. He needed to bail, now. Hartley checked his altimeter, 1,400 feet, still over water. If he bailed here, he'd hit the channel. Cold, deep. The dinghy might deploy, might not. The parachute might work, might tangle in the burning wreckage. 1,400 feet wasn't much height, barely enough for the chute to open fully. If he waited 2 more minutes, he'd be over land. 2 minutes. The cockpit was on fire. The seat, the control panel, the sidewalls, flames climbing the canopy frame. His gloves were smoking, leather charring. He could feel the heat through them. His hands were burning, not severely, not yet, but the pain was there. Sharp, insistent. The Spitfire was at 900 feet, dropping fast. The glide angle was too steep. He wasn't going to make the cliffs. He'd hit the shoreline. Maybe. If he kept the nose up. If the plane didn't break apart before then. 600 feet. The coastline was right there. Individual buildings. Roads. A church steeple. Fields. Green. Peaceful. He was over the beach. Sand. Rocks. The tide was out. The cliffs were ahead. White. Too high. He wasn't going to clear them. 400 feet. The B-17 was over land. Safe. Climbing slightly. The crew was watching. All of them now. Faces pressed against every window. Hartley reached for the canopy release. Yellow and black striped handle. Pulled it. The canopy flew off. Ripped away by the slipstream. The wind hit him. Cold. Clean. The flames roared higher. The fire consumed the cockpit in seconds. His jacket was burning. His sleeves. 300 feet. He rolled the Spitfire inverted. Nose up, then over. Upside down. He released his straps. 4-point harness. All of it. fell. The parachute deployed. The chute opened. White silk, but he was too low. Didn't have time to slow him. The harness bit into his chest, but he was still falling. Fast. He hit the ground 12 seconds later. Hard. The impact shattered his left leg. He felt it break. Heard it. 3 ribs snapped. Like dry wood. He rolled. Couldn't stop. Momentum carried him into a stone fence. His head hit the rocks. Everything went white. The Spitfire hit 30 yards away. Exploded. The fuel tanks went up. A fireball 200 feet wide. The blast wave knocked the air out of his lungs. Heat washed over him. He lay there. Couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. A farmer named Thomas Whitley found him 4 minutes later. He'd been working his field when he saw the plane come down, saw the explosion, ran over. Found Hartley by the fence, unconscious. Bleeding, broken. Whitley called for help. The medics arrived, 2 ambulances. They loaded Hartley onto a stretcher, carefully, rushed him to hospital in Dover, 14 miles away. Hartley died in the ambulance. Internal bleeding, ruptured spleen, punctured lung. The medic said he was conscious for part of the ride, eyes open, didn't say anything, didn't ask about the B-17, just stared at the ceiling. Then he stopped breathing. The medic tried to revive him, started chest compressions, couldn't bring him back. He was 27 years old. The B-17, tail number 297, landed at RAF Thurley 14 minutes after Hartley went down. All 9 crew members walked off, uninjured, shaken, alive. They filed a report. Mentioned the Spitfire pilot who stayed with them, flew with them, burned for them. They didn't know his name. His radio had been dead. They'd never spoken. They just knew he'd saved them. It took 3 days for the RAF to connect the crashed Spitfire near Dover with Flight Lieutenant Aaron Hartley. 3 days of checking records, cross-referencing mission logs. By then, he'd already been buried. Military funeral, full honors. His parents were there, his father, his mother, his sister, Sarah. Sarah wore black, a simple dress. She stood at the graveside and didn't cry, just stared. At the coffin, at the flag draped over it, Union Jack. At the hole in the ground that would swallow the man she was supposed to marry in 3 months. The letters in the map case burned with the plane, all 3. The one about the cottage, the one about the wedding plans, the one where she said she loved him and couldn't wait for him to come home. Ash. Smoke. Gone. The B-17 crew found out his name 2 weeks later. Someone at command told them. They sent a letter to Sarah, collective, all 9 signatures, told her what he did, that he stayed, that he flew with them when he could have bailed, that 9 men made it home because her fiancé chose to burn, that they were sorry, that they'd never forget. She kept the letter, put it in a drawer with his photographs, his medals, the ring he'd bought but never given her, sterling silver, simple band. She never moved to the cottage near Canterbury. She said it wouldn't be right, not without him. She stayed in Maidstone, worked at the hospital, 30 more years. She never married. When people asked why, she said she'd already met the person she was supposed to spend her life with. She just didn't get long enough with him. Flight Lieutenant Aaron Hartley flew a burning aircraft for 40 miles, so 9 men could bail out over land instead of water. Every one of them survived. He didn't. The plane burned. The letters burned. The cottage stayed empty. He's buried in Kent, St. Mary's churchyard, 14 miles from the cottage Sarah never moved into. The headstone is simple. Name, rank, date. The wedding was supposed to be in June. It never happened, but 9 families stayed whole. 9 men saw their children grow up, lived full lives. Would you have stayed in that cockpit? Would you have flown through fire when you could have bailed? If stories like this matter to you, if you need to understand what sacrifice looks like when there's no parade waiting and no cameras rolling, then you know what to do. These aren't hero stories. They're cost stories, and the cost is never small. Subscribe if that's something worth remembering, because there are more stories like this. Stories about what people gave so others could go home. And they deserve to be told.